I think to probably some well-intentioned people putting this together who haven't got a clue about what they're talking about.
There's this website, and I sent this to Mark ahead of time so he could take a look at it. And I've seen a few pretty prominent big name evangelicals putting forward this website as, something pointing to something with regard to police reform, and looking at it and saying, these are things that Christians should get behind as police reform. And I don't come from a law enforcement family. I don't know that much about law enforcement. So I look at these things and, maybe I can represent the average person in this conversation. I have no idea if these are good ideas or not. The name of the website is called 8cantwait.org. And it's, I gave it to Bob to put up there. And so if you could scroll down a little bit, Bob, there's some reforms there in those boxes of what reforms they're suggesting. But this, I don't know if these are good ideas or not. Monique read through some of them and she said, well, I think some of these we already have. I don't know. I'm just curious, Mark, if you have any thoughts about these reforms. Do you see these as potentially helpful? Some of them we already have. I'm just curious if you have any general thoughts on this.
I do. I think to probably some well-intentioned people putting this together who haven't got a clue about what they're talking about. And I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way, but truly, when I look at this and I see some of the things that are posted, and I'm looking at the site on my other screen over here, so I apologize for looking away. Yeah. But if you're looking at the diagram that's actually a chart, says requires de-escalation. Well, the requirement for de-escalation has been around for 20 years or more. So that's really nothing new. The next one has a use of force continuum. The use of force continuum has been around for at least 30 years, maybe even longer than that. It's been propagated in police training for decades. So I'm not quite sure why they would think that that's something novel. The question is what goes on in that continuum. So, if they're claiming that's some kind of novelty, they're wrong. The next one is to ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Strangleholds have never been anything that the police departments wanted to do. It's ineffective. A stranglehold, puts the arm against the throat. Same thing with a chokehold. And when you put your arm against the throat, actually that's a chokehold. All it does is cut off the air and turns the person into a panic. And at that point, the fight's even worse because the person is absolutely. You turn your oxygen off, and you're going to fight to get that oxygen back. It's like being thrown in the water and starting to drown. You panic. So that's always been something that, at least police agencies that are sophisticated, banned a long time ago, 40 years, maybe longer than that. The stranglehold, which is really kind of an odd name to put it, it should, if you're going to use the term stranglehold, you have to define it. Yeah. There was a term, the upper body carotid restraint, and it goes by different names. And what that is, when you put the arm across the neck on the side to restrict the blood flow to the brain or to restrict the blood flow out of the brain. And what that does is it renders the person unconscious without permanent injury. And that's been banned in a lot of places since the 1980s. A lot of places didn't ban it for good reason, because it was very effective in preventing people from getting hit by batons, having trauma from other kinds of direct strikes. If you have to beat somebody into submission rather than rendering them unconscious and letting them, when you put the handcuffs on them while they're still unconscious, and it only lasts for about 10 seconds, you save them from a lot of injury. The problem with what they call a stranglehold, and I'm presuming they're talking about that carotid restraint, is that there have been a few deaths that were that correlated with it. In other words, somebody that was applied and the person died afterwards. And so they correlated the death with that particular use of force. And there were political influences to make it look like that was the cause, and while they were ignoring the fact that these people also had drugs in their bodies and had other physical ailments. So there were many of those deaths may have happened just from a protracted fight all by itself without using that carotid restraint. Nevertheless, it has been banned in most places. The state of California, for example, just passed a law to ban it. I think my own personal opinion is that if it's used properly, and it was used properly most of the time, it actually prevents more injuries than it causes. But politically, it's just not going to survive. So I look at that and I say, okay, if you think that's really a reform, okay, it's been there for a long time. Requires warning before shooting. You have to ask yourself, why would anybody come up with that? I mean, you don't just shoot people because you have 15 or 20 seconds to think about it. Most police shootings occur because there's something immediate. It's a snap decision. The person makes some movement that fits a pattern that the officer has been taught that corresponds to a deadly threat. When that happens, you don't have time to say, hey, would you please not pull that gun out and kill me? Because by the time you're done talking, or by the time you're done warning, you're dead. Mm-hmm. So when I said that people who have put this up there may be well-intentioned, they're hoping that you warn somebody and then they'll give up. That's naive. It's not even close to being practical or real. When you have a shooting of a situation like somebody pulls a gun out on you, there's no talking. It happens in less than 1.5 seconds from start to finish. So are there conditions when you might think of using it? Well, you might think of it if you have somebody who's armed, let's say with a knife instead of a gun. And they're far enough away where you can tell them if you get any closer, you will get shot. But that depends on the distance. If they're right on you, you've got to shoot them immediately because they can kill you with a knife just as fast as they can kill you with a gun if they're close to you. And close to you means within a couple of steps. Mm-hmm. So if they're far enough away and you can say, look, don't drop the knife. If you come at me, you're going to die. Do it. Say that. But we're taught to do that anyway. Everybody's taught to do that. So I don't know that that's anything novel. The problem is if you say requires warning shots before shooting in all cases, that's absolutely unrealistic. The next one is restrict shooting at moving vehicles. This one is a particularly good one. Shooting at moving vehicles is generally speaking ineffective. If you shoot at a moving vehicle, several things can happen. One, you got a lot of stray rounds running down range, and you're putting people in a hazardous situation that you really don't want to. There are rare situations where it's a useful thing to do, but they're so rare that the policy itself could have that exception built into it. So for example, if you're out in an open area and somebody comes on with, let's say a four-wheeler shows up and you're in a football field and they're just circling around and they're trying to run you over repeatedly. At that point, you can't keep running away because the truck can keep going faster than you can keep running. And at that point, you don't have a choice. But all the rest of the times, suspects trying to get away, or they're shooting at the vehicle, they're shooting from the vehicle while they're driving away, or something like that. That's probably not a good time to be shooting at the moving vehicle. And the policy that would forbid that, or at least restrict it, is a wise policy. Many organizations have that now and have had. I know Los Angeles Police Department's had that for at least 10 years. No longer than that, about 15 years. And it was always one where, even before that, it was shooting at moving vehicles is perilous and may be fruitless. So that makes sense. That one's one that I think actually does make sense. Requires exhausting all other means before shooting. That's been part of the law and part of policies all over the country for as long as they've been, well, actually since the 1970s. And it doesn't mean that if it says requires exhausting all other means, that I don't know what in the world you would be exhausting if somebody pulls out a gun immediately. And what means are there? There aren't any other means. So there's nothing to exhaust. And so I guess they're thinking something like you punch them or do something like that. I don't know. But that one doesn't make any sense to me, exhausting all other means before shooting. The only time that makes sense is in a situation where there's time. So if the person's far enough away, doesn't have a pistol or a rifle or a handgun or something like that, or even a bow and arrow, because that shoots just about as fast as a pistol in practical terms, because the arrow goes so fast. But if they have a knife or a club or something like that, the officer should try to exhaust other means. Can they use a taser? Can they use some other device? Technologies are evolving on that. It makes sense to try to use other less than lethal force, but that's been built into the law and the policies for decades. It's nothing new. I would just say requires exhausting all other means when practical. I would add that to it, because there are times when it is not. And the last one, right, there's two more. One's a duty to intervene. That has been a policy for as long as I've been in policing. So whether police officers obeyed that and actually responded to it is a different question. But there is a duty to intervene.
Define what that is, the duty to intervene, because the
duty to intervene is a duty to stop other officers from doing what the officers know is wrong. So if, let's say, a suspect he's handcuffed, he's on the ground, he's not fighting, he's not doing anything, and another officer walks up and starts kicking him. Okay, the officers who are there have a duty to pull that officer away from him and report him. That's a duty to intervene. You intervene to protect the suspect from an attack against an officer that's unjustified. That's the duty to intervene. So that policy and those policies have existed for decades. For as long as the 36 years that I was in, that policy existed on Los Angeles Police Department and other places. When I was teaching police management all over the state, all the departments had that, and it was built into the policy, but not all of the officers would do it. So having a culture where they would do that is more important than the rule itself, because the rule itself is only as good as the officers who are going to obey it. The last one requires comprehensive reporting. I can only speak for the Los Angeles Police Department, but we've had comprehensive reporting since the 1980s. And I mean comprehensive reporting of every use of force, had a report that attended it. And those became statistical. And it was more than anything to determine which techniques and tactics were the most efficient. And were there particular individual officers who were more prone to using force than others? And if so, why? So it became an investigative tool, not in the sense of misconduct, but an investigative tool to determine whether somebody needs training or whether they should stay in the police work. Because if you get somebody who resorts to violence every single opportunity, that's probably somebody you need to look at moving out of police work. And so it was looked at then. And I completely agree that comprehensive reporting, if that means any use of force where somebody is likely to get injured, then I would agree with that. And they should keep statistics on that, and they should tie that, and what that doesn't say is that it should be tied to personnel metrics. And that's where you make your money on this. That's how you get your police reform. If you just report stuff and you just stuff the reports in a drawer, so what? Okay, you've got comprehensive reporting. But if it isn't until you tie that to some kind of metric, like what I just mentioned, which officers are together when the force occurs, which officers are alone when the force occurs. Does this occur when the people who they're using the force on are of a particular race? Does it occur under particular assignments? Those kind of data are extremely important and very, very useful in assessing whether your use of force policy is effective, your training is effective, or whether your officer is effective, your supervision is effective. None of that gets talked about when you talk about police reform, but when you're on the inside, and my position as an executive looking at these kinds of things for decades, you realize that all of that has to go together, and anything less than that is simplistic. And that requires comprehensive reporting is simplistic if it doesn't tie it to metrics and to associating it with all the kinds of factors that would determine the efficiency and effectiveness of the officers and their training.